Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. The show has been running for over 6 years now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. Before I go any further, I'm delighted to say that this episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Copenhagen-based design festival 3 Days of Design. The theme for this year's event, which runs from the 18th to the 20th of June, is Keep It Real. According to the organisers, it's a call to be true to your own vision while echoing a desire for a world that's more caring and inclusive. On a more practical level, there are 8 new design districts throughout the city this year. You'll find Material Matters at Gammel Dok in Christianshavn, for example, which is a district focusing on materials and the importance of making, celebrating the rich artisanal history of the area. Visitors can look forward to a hands-on experience of craft skills and innovative materials by artists who use them to create the objects that define our spaces. The whole festival promises to be a complete treat. You've got to come, trust me. I think it's important to point out that my guest today is neither a designer nor an architect, but he is a prolific commissioner of both. David Venables is the European Director for the American Hardwood Export Council, which might not sound especially sexy, but under his direction, the organisation has been incredibly effective at promoting US hardwoods across the continent, working with the likes of Alison Brooks, Waugh Thistleton, Heatherwick Studio, Jaime Hayon and Stefan Diez to create an array of installations and products that extol the virtues of wood. Its latest installation, Number 1 Common, will launch at this year's Material Matters Copenhagen. Importantly too, David is someone steeped in the wood industry from birth. This is a man who really knows his material. David, thanks very much for doing this. How are you?
Oh, you're very welcome. It's very exciting. I feel very privileged to be allowed into the hallowed fame of architects, designers, makers. I'm none of those. I'm a wood scientist, as you've alluded to.
Well, we will get into the wood science a bit later on in the interview. Was that intro okay?
Oh, it was more than okay. You're very generous.
We have a tradition on this podcast of asking people really to describe where they are. I mean, it's a throwback to the days when I used to interview guests in their workshops and studios. AHEC, are you located in the middle of a forest? I mean, you've got quite a lot of wood around you, David, but where are you right now?
Yes, I'm away from my AHEC team because this is my AHEC office and has been for 25 years. And I'm 5 miles outside Hay-on-Wye.
Right.
On the Welsh border. Very privileged to be able to live here. And of course, I was traveling into London every week when we first moved, and Zoom, internet connections, that kind of thing. And I do a lot of travel in Europe anyway. So this has always been my base.
So you work from home, and I can see a record collection behind you. I know for a fact that your microphone is resting on 2 books devoted to wood. I mean, this is how
correct
into the material you are.
There's another bookshelf full of wood books. I collect wood books, some of them going back 100 years or so.
Tell me a little bit about the structure of AHEC, because you're where you are in Hay-on-Wye. There's an office in London. How does the organisation work?
So it's global. It has a sort of HQ or head office in Washington. It's quite a unique organisation, really. And I think that's what's been so interesting, being part of it and the things we can do, because at one level, we're a trade association with individual sawmill members, wood producers, mostly in the eastern United States. And then at another level, we get the benefit, we have to apply for it, US government funding that's been coming through the US Department of Agriculture. And they've been making promotional funding available now for well over 30 years. This is my 30th year working on the AHEC programs, and we've been funded that way that time.
Okay. So all your funds come from the federal government, in other words?
The bulk of them that we do the communication with. So what you visibly see, why we can do these collaborations, is because we're not just reliant on industry funding. They raise money for other things, but we can run a global program. We've got offices in China, running out of Hong Kong, in Mexico, and we operate in the Middle East, Australia. A lot of our sawmills, they're exporting to well over 50 countries.
So how many people approximately work for AHEC?
I think staff-wise, in the various offices, locations, it's probably just over 20, but we have many, many more who are affiliated. Some are as good as staff. They're consultants who've worked with us for years and years on particular fields, whether it's environmental, technical, PR, communication, of course, because that's really what we are. We're the communication arm of the US hardwood industry. But we've been in this position where with our profile and the funding we've got, we've been able to shout about hardwood particularly, but all wood at a much higher level, bringing in issues that are relevant for all the wood sector, really. I grew up in it, so I champion it. And this vehicle has allowed me to do both, satisfy a personal desire and interest and aim, but also to do good things for the American wood industry.
Well, I guess the first thing we need to talk about is your installation that's debuting at this year's Material Matters in Copenhagen, which is a new event we're launching. It's called Number One Common, and you've asked a group of, I'd say, youngish, probably the best way of putting it, youngish designers, Daniel Schofield, Maria Øfstedal Eng, and Andu Masebo, to work on a particular kind of type of wood. So what is Number One Common?
It's an unusual title for an exhibition, but it is also the name of a grade of timber. So we work with hardwoods. They're visually graded by sawmills. They're not graded for structure. They're graded for appearance. And the Americans produce in very large volumes. So they're looking to maximize as much as they can out of every valuable tree or log. So those boards are cut up to maximize that yield and then graded according to how much clear wood there is.
So when you say clear wood, what is clear wood?
Well, there are certain defined defects in wood. So, a big knot that you couldn't, machine or work round would be a defect. There would be things like bird peck or, splits in the wood. Those would be bits of wood that weren't seen as sound. Now, you still get them in the board, but you're only paying for, so the higher grades would have well over 80%, 85% clear wood. Whereas the grade we're working at is going to have 2/3 or 66% clear wood. And therefore, you still get the same size board. Some of the clear areas will be smaller. So the idea was the top grade was for joinery, long length staircases, where you need longer, clearer pieces of wood. And the next grade down was for furniture, cabinets, where you use shorter pieces. And then there is a grade below it, 2 common, which would be strip flooring, block flooring, that kind of thing. And they set these rules up 120 years ago. They've been there. They're still there and maintained by the National Hardwood Lumber Association. We're running a workshop even today as I speak for timber importers in the UK.
So in other words, the designers could be using any timber from the American hardwood forests. It's about the quality of the timber they're using.
We work from donations for our industry. We're allowed to fund collaborations, but when it comes to buying wood, we get that from our industry. And they gave us a container from different sawmills of 4 species that are overlooked in Europe: red oak, hard maple, cherry, and yellow birch. We've never done a project in Europe with yellow birch before. Very exciting. So Anna Maria is working with yellow birch, block laminating it and doing really interesting things. Red oak, we've done a lot of promotion for because it's a brilliant oak. It's vastly available and we keep coming back to it because this can add a new dimension really to the hardwood usage in Europe. We've narrowed so much of what we do in terms of wood species, both with softwoods and hardwoods, that's really important to expand. And it's all Number One Common grade, which most importers are not stocking in Europe. So this was a completely new grade of material, but also species for them.
Okay. And I should mention that the exhibition has been designed by Kia Utzon Frank. When you do a project like this, how do you go about selecting your designers? Why that particular quartet?
Oh, that's a very difficult question.
I'm here to ask the hard questions, David.
I'm going to get into trouble. There's no formula. Quite often, it just falls into place. And I think I've always said we start a project with why. Why are we going to do it? What's the message? If there isn't a message, don't do it. Then who is the most important thing after that? And you start to think about who is going to be able to tell that story, create that narrative, get a benefit from it, engage in it. And the what, where, when, how follows really almost easily, in a sense, when you've got the right why and the right who. We met Andu about a year and a half ago now in London, and I was just intrigued by what he was doing, the storytelling he was doing with design materials. In a sense, we sort of collected him as I'd really like to do something, and to bring his kind of narrative and storytelling and sort of passion. We just connected, really. Anna Maria, we'd worked with the last time we did a project in 3 days, the project 3. We were just blown away by her energy, enthusiasm, her ability to make and design. She creates extraordinary artistic forms in her furniture. And I first met her in Milan. So again, you're recommended people, you meet people, and you think, oh, that's an interesting mix. They didn't all know each other. And then Daniel is a Brit, but he's moved back to Copenhagen recently and is now based there. He'd worked with Benchmark. We've built this whole project around Benchmark Furniture, who we've done many collaborations with. And we did a lot of experimentation with them before we started the project, so that we brought the designers into the workshop, showed them the material. We explored ways to make better use of the lower grade material before they even began designing.
We've had Sean from Benchmark on the podcast in the past, and he's very good value. I mean, I'm kind of interested. Have the types of designers you commission for projects like this evolved over the years? The first time I recall seeing one of your projects was 2008 with David Adjaye, when he built a pavilion on the South Bank out of American tulip wood. Over the years, you've had the likes of John Pawson, Norman Foster, Richard Rogers attached to your projects, such as Wishlist. Then there was Legacy, where you created a product for some of London's cultural leaders, including John Sorrell and Maria Belshaw, the director of Tate, and Tristram Hunt from the V&A. But the kind of designer you involve in these projects seems to have changed, I'd say quite profoundly. Would that be fair?
I think we've looked in a different direction, probably because of COVID. We did one of our most interesting projects as lockdown happened. Again, it was with Benchmark because they stayed open and it was connected. And we got to work with probably some of the greats you've mentioned, which normally we wouldn't have had an opportunity. But out of the back of that, I had a discussion in London. We opened the show in the Design Museum. We couldn't go to platforms. Design fairs were shut. Milan was shut. London was shut. There was nothing going on. So we needed to go to a physical space. And we built a relationship with the Design Museum in London, opened to a limited audience with not all our designers being able to come. We created the project with them doing everything remotely. So none of them, not even Thomas Heatherwick, who was the only designer based in the UK, couldn't come to the workshop. We said, no, that's not fair. The whole point is to try and meet that challenge. But I got talking to Sebastian Herkner from Germany, who we worked with on that project. And he just said, I'm really worried about a lost generation of designers. So many of the designers we know who've made it teach, they give back. Stefan Diez is a wonderful example. He's teaching in Austria and running the platforms there. And many of the others are doing that. Young designers couldn't finish their shows. They had got no platforms to show their work. So we then went on to do projects like Discovered and Slow Furniture for Fast Change with students from the DAC region. We did also one in Spain, working with young designers. So we've orientated to fresh minds, fresh ideas. Our design lineup for Copenhagen are not new designers. They're all established, but they're part of a new generation that's thinking differently, using different materials. I think they're more materially aware, perhaps. That's not a criticism, but I think that's kind of a natural thing for that generation. And they're exploring a new way of doing things and a new way of communicating through their designs. So That's brilliant. That's really refreshing. You don't have to have a famous name. What you need is people who get what we're trying to do. We're trying to change the narrative about a really important material that can be easily misunderstood.
And COVID prompted that shift, which is really interesting.
Yes, it did.
Do you have a favourite project that you've done over the years?
Oh, no. Another terrible question. Connected because it was so unique of its time, and you look back at it and you think, wow, that will always be a piece of history. Those early projects, I think, without doubt, one of the most exciting because it was the highest profile was The Endless Stair with Alex de Rijke, working with tulip with CLT, the first time hardwood CLT had been used anywhere in the world. And then Alex went on to do the Maggies in Oldham, which is a permanent building using that technology. That was really exciting because that's doing something completely experimental outside the Tate in front of the whole of London. And yet it led to a change in thinking.
It's really interesting that, because I was going to ask whether you've seen tangible results from these projects. I mean, you talked about Alex de Rijke and him doing the Maggies, having worked with you on the Endless Stair, which I think is really interesting. And you've also mentioned red oak, which you've pushed very hard over the last few years, for instance. And as a result of that, can you see the market using more red oak?
Oh, it is already. We're not the only reason, of course. The availability of other materials has, and there are cost market implications. Red oak is more competitive. The block was manufacturers weren't used to it and designers hadn't seen it, weren't being offered it. I've never, ever had a designer, architect or any consumer I've shown a piece of red oak to go, oh, we don't like that. And yet the trade and industry, oh no, my customers don't want red oak.
That begs the question, why is that, David? Why does that situation occur?
I think it's, if you're manufacturing a one-off, you maybe got more flexibility. If you're mass producing or you're producing a product that you've got to sell many times, you want consistency, it's familiarization. It's become easier for manufacturers to narrow, but also they can switch quite easily between European oak and American white oak because they're very similar in color. And they also have a bit more durability for use outside, which that's still important. Whereas the red oak just needs a little bit more getting to know, I suppose, and you can't necessarily mix it in, but we are now. You're seeing Spanish and Italian manufacturers are using red oak and mixing it in with other oak in products if you're staining or coloring, It was just getting across that it wasn't the poor relation. It wasn't the poor oak relation. And again, we did a lot of experimental work. We created films. And then we did project like The Legacy, taking well-known designers and amazing commissioners. And that was all in red oak. And it kind of, that plus a whole series of other projects. Red oak's now the third most important hardwood timber from the US coming into Europe, behind white oak and tulip wood.
Well, there you go. I should stress that red oak isn't actually red, is it? I mean, it can have a slightly pinky hue. Just worth pointing out for people who aren't that au fait with the wood world.
And you know why it's called red oak?
The leaf, right?
The leaf.
Yeah, there you go. You've mentioned it, but I think it's worth going into a little more detail about the forests that AHEC represents. Where are they in the States?
Most of what we represent and most of the natural hardwood is East Coast. So you're talking as far as Louisiana in the south, right the way up to Maine, east of the Mississippi. And there are a few states in the West, Washington, around Oregon, where you get maple, you get some oaks, you get smaller volumes of hardwood, and you get a really important timber, which is being used in furniture, which is red alder. It's quite light, it's quite cherry looking in color. And the German furniture industry used to use vast volumes. It's still used in Asia, but most of that forest is on the east. There's something like 33 of the US states are hardwood producing states. But I mean, the big ones, it's Tennessee, Mississippi, and then the Appalachians, North Carolina, the Virginias, New York State, Michigan, Wisconsin, it's that whole belt.
It goes all the way up to Canada, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, maple, doesn't know the boundaries. Canadian maple leaf, of course, and maple syrup. So up in those northern US states, you get a lot of hard maple. It's a cold weather tree, so it has a much shorter growing season than species that you will find down in the south, where it's almost tropical.
So there is a huge diversity of tree in these forests.
Oh, massive.
Why is that important?
Well, it gives variety. Why are there so many species in the US compared with, say, Europe? Because a lot of them are similar. Ash, maples, walnut, oak, cherry. We have those species in Europe. But the Americans have sapgum, hickory, pecan, hackberry, tulipwood. And also they have not one oak like we do in Europe principally. They've got, I think there are hundreds of red oaks and hundreds of white oaks. I mean, there's only maybe half a dozen any commercial volume. And they have two groups of maples. So they've got the hard maples growing in the north, but the soft maples, which aren't soft, by the way, that's another name issue. It's the not so hard maple, we call it, is found in a much wider range. I mean, that grows right the way down to the south. Those species look very different. So ash from the south and ash from the north, the ash in the south is going to grow much quicker. Then you've got the Appalachians, so things grow up at altitude, even though they're in the south. They look like northern species. We have more consistency in Europe of soil, of climate. So that brings a challenge. It's also part of the excitement for designers particularly, but you need to know what it is you're going to get. And you do get variation, so it challenges manufacturers sometimes. But that diversity is coming because it's just a huge natural forest that when the Ice Age came, the mountain ranges in the US, of course, run parallel. You know, the Andes, the Rockies, the Appalachians. So in fact, the ice sort of pushed the fauna and flora down into what we now know as the Southern Americas. And then, of course, when it receded, a lot of those species still survived. Whereas in Europe, the Pyrenees, the Alps, chopped off a lot of our flora and fauna. And it's kind of always been because of that.
I hope you're enjoying the show. One of the things to look out for when you're travelling around 3 Days of Design's various districts is the eye point. Each district will have one, and they're there to help visitors find information, inspiration, and installations. For the first time, visitors can meet a dedicated 3 Days of Design district manager at each design district to help improve their experience. Drawing on their in-depth knowledge, the district manager will be available to share historical highlights and cultural insights. From here, you'll be able to join the design walks and meet the very first festival design ambassadors. 3 Days of Design runs from the 18th to the 20th of June. It's a wonderful event, and we would love to see you there at Material Matters Copenhagen. To find out more, go to 3daysofdesign.dk. That's 3daysofdesign.dk. There's a quote by the writer who's been on this podcast, actually, Rob Penn, who wrote The Man Who Made Things Out of Trees. And it's a quote that I really like. He pointed out that some historians believe that ownership of trees was as instrumental as tax on tea in raising cries for political representation that brought about the American Revolution. The forest was not just a physical resource, it was also the environment where some have argued the dynamism of the American character was forged. Is that a sentiment you agree with?
I'm not sure I know enough about that history to comment, perhaps as well as he can, but I think there's no doubt that the work we've done in understanding what the forest was originally, what it then became through the Industrial Revolution, or what it wasn't, because a lot of it disappeared.
Yes, can we talk about that? Because it's had a slightly turbulent history, the forest.
Oh, hugely.
So cleared for sheep, used by the British Navy for their boats and ships. I'm interested if we can have a little bit of a potted history of how it's changed over the years.
I mean, those were perhaps more minor changes, right, in the sense that the early settlers and the sheep farms, they did some clearance. There was charcoal farming in, the early 1800s, particularly in places like Pennsylvania. But actually the charcoal farmers were sort of clearing an area, moving on, understanding that the forest grew back and they could come back to it again. What really did for all those eastern forests was the Industrial Revolution. So somewhere like Williamsport in Pennsylvania, which you may or may not have heard of, it's a relatively small town, was the center of the world's lumber industry at one stage in the sort of mid-1800s. There were more millionaires living in Williamsport than anywhere else in the US. It was the lumber capital of the world. Logs were coming off all the mountains, other states, down the Susquehanna River, in vast volumes. I mean, a lot of the softwood got just left to rot because the bark and things was being used for tanning leather, pit props, mining, building. So there was huge devastation, and that devastation, realization in the early 1900s that, oh my word, our communities have always been surrounded by forests. That's what we found. That's what we farmed. We then, farming moved to the Midwest, to the plains, more suitable for the farming. The forest grew back where the sheep farming had been. But this destruction, there was then a whole load of energy with Roosevelt in the 20s. And in fact, I believe a German forester was a trigger for creating the US Forest Service and the first forestry schools, and sort of gradually laws and a structure that started to protect. Those communities are still there. We're there before, they're there now. It's very much about communities. It's one of the reasons why that forest, they did something all at the same time all those years ago.
So it grew back, in other words, what you're saying?
It grew back.
Yeah. Did it grow back differently?
Yes.
How?
Because you'd clear cut it so much that actually the pioneering species of the oaks, maples, what was there before was mixed hardwood and softwood. So you actually got better quality in terms of market value, trees coming back. So take somewhere like Pennsylvania. It's a good example because it's one of the bigger hardwood producing states, and it's towards the top end of the Appalachians. By the end of the Industrial Revolution, it was maybe 10% forested. It had been 80% forested when the settlers first arrived. It's now back to sort of 70, 75% forested. And that's grown back. And the cherry particularly grew there because it was a pioneering species. It got a lot of light and it grew back in proliferation.
So it's an environmental success story, fundamentally, is what you're saying.
Yeah. It's a really interesting thing about the cherry, though, because one of the reasons it was prolific wasn't just the light. It got its nitrogen from the Industrial Revolution. All the factories, all the smog, it actually benefited. So it became the global center for cherry. I mean, there's more cherry in the Allegheny forest than anywhere else in the world. Do you know what's happening now?
I mean, no, would be. This is why I'm talking to you, David.
Cherry is beginning proliferation for the next generations. It's slowing down. The quality is slowing down. Why? Scientists have been able to actually link it to the emergence of the Clean Air Act in 1992, which reduced air pollution. So now other species like black birch are benefiting and are starting the next generations. We've been making a documentary about the forests over the last year or two, which we hope will come out in the autumn. Part of that we filmed in the Menominee Tribal Reserve up in Wisconsin, and that's 200,000 acres of forest you could see from the satellite. And they manage 7 generations ahead. It's quite extraordinary that their kind of vision for allowing nature, they take out the sick and the drying trees, the ones that aren't so good, they leave the good ones behind, and your forest gets healthier.
Well, that's really interesting because I do want to ask you about that, because there is a sentiment out there, quite commonly held, that cutting down any tree is a bad thing. I mean, in the UK, there's been an uproar about a pair of men hacking down the Sycamore Gap tree in Northumberland. That tree, and trees in general, really, really matter to people. But it is also important to manage a forest. So why?
Gosh, it's a big question. So there's a number of levels. We need trees, we need forests to survive. So on a really big scale, the damage that's been done to places like the Amazon has affected climate dramatically. It's affected global warming, the ability to sequester carbon. The eastern states is actually an area that has not increased in temperature. It's actually cooled while the rest of the world has been heating up. or many parts of the world. And the reason is the forests. The forests are responsible for, generating rain. Some people even believe part of the global wind patterns. So we need trees, and we need them for our well-being. We need them for our quality of air, for watercourse management, just soil, food. They've always been part of our lives. So we have them in our garden. We have them everywhere. And of course, you've got iconic examples, and you've still got what we call old growth forest. It's a bit of a myth because they were farming the Amazon 2,500 years ago, the settlers, the indigenous people living there. So there's no such thing really as pure virgin forest. Man has integrated with it over thousands of years. So you need to manage it, because once you've done that, you can have a much healthier forest. And I think the balance is, do we want it just to look at so it gets older and it dies, it stops sequestering, it puts its carbon back into the atmosphere?
Because older trees don't sequester carbon in the same way that younger trees do.
No. And the other thing is trees have a limited life. We've filmed recently an old oak tree. It came down in Asheville in North Carolina. It was 200 years old, just about to turn. As it was cut open, you could see the very beginnings of rot. So you've still got a tree, but you don't have material. We need material. We've always used this material. You mentioned it, shipbuilding, the Industrial Revolution in the States. We build our houses with it. We've always used it. We now need to use it much more, because we've suddenly realized that all the other materials that we're using have a whole load of consequences, and we need to change our thinking. So there's a definite need to use more wood. Therefore, we've got to protect and allow the forests where there's been deforestation and overexploitation, whether it's through farming or whatever reason. It's really good that's now recognized as agriculture being the main driver of deforestation, particularly in places like the Amazon. We need to allow communities that get the political will so that those forests are restored. But then we need to look at where we've got proliferation of forest and go, wow, we've got huge bread baskets of fiber we can be using, and we should make more use of. And what's happening in the US, Grant, is right now is a worry, because that forest grew back because of that decimation I talked about. It's coming to maturity all at the same time, largely. Now, it varies. Some trees, some hardwoods will grow to maturity in 60 years. Others take 120. It depends. But essentially, that's an old forest now. And if what's happening for the first time the last few years, we're actually getting more mortality in volume than we are harvesting. So that's wasted material. And there are moments, it is sometimes a really important thing to cut down a tree, because it's had its life. It doesn't live forever. If it's part of a forest, it's going to have a young generation coming up. It's going to be better for wildlife.
And it opens up the canopy and allows other lighting, allows other younger trees to grow. Yeah.
It's also then, really important to use that wood and use that material and lock up that carbon and get the well-being and all the benefits from that material. But it's also important to be responsible about how we process, use the material. So nature's producing all this amazing grains and colors and variations, and you'll see some of that in Copenhagen. It's an exciting, very exciting visual exhibition, probably one of the most. But the extraordinary thing is, and what we're challenging with this exhibition, is the wood industries spend a lot of time and money and effort, because that's what's perceived that the market wants, of taking out all the natural bits, the variations, the so-called defects or characteristics, to try and get clear wood products. Last week, I was on holiday for a few days, and my Airbnb had a kitchen floor that had saw marks in it. It was oak. Just every bit of character you could possibly imagine. It was plastic.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't wood at all. Yeah. It was totally and utterly artificial. So the reproduction of wood
includes all the flaws.
It's taking all that character. We're cutting it out.
That's hilarious.
And one of the reasons, so what we're going to do in Copenhagen, we've created panels using this one common, some of them clear, which take a bit longer and you get, not as good a yield. And then the same size panels, we've allowed all the character in, and we're actually going to do some market research and ask people, which do you prefer and why?
Interesting.
We're trying to change the conversation around what a wood product could and should look like.
And it kind of dovetails with my next, point come question, which is I was at the Make Good symposium at the V&A a couple of months ago now, listened to a speech from Jez Ralph of Evolving Forests, who was talking about the future of forestry, I guess primarily from his perspective in the UK. I'm going to paraphrase him, but he discussed the relationship between supply and demand, which you've mentioned in this interview so far, in the forest, and how our forests have been demand-led, but we're going to have to get used to them being supply-led. In other words, foresters are going to do what's best for the forest rather than kowtow to the market and plant whatever consumers, retailers, whoever are demanding. We will get the wood that suits the forest and not vice versa. Is that happening, or has that been happening for longer in the US?
Oh, it's the whole AHEC mantra.
Yeah.
It's what we built our entire effort on. We promote what nature produces, and you've got to try and match that to what the market needs, demands. And it's a really hard thing because we're governed by trends, fashions. I mean, they are potentially the enemy of sustainability. And certainly with our forests, what's happening, that diverse mix, if you're only using 2 or 3 species out of those 20 or 30 you could be using, you only really want the upper grade, which is 10, 15% of the tree, and you don't want the rest of it. How's that forest going to be sustainable? So it's absolutely essential, but also consumers are losing out. They're not getting a choice. If they don't see all that character wood, or they don't see something made in a yellow birch or a red oak, they're not going to ask for it.
How do fashions happen in the wood industry, David? I mean, you can understand it in the fashion world. You've got 4 seasons or sometimes more, and it happens in Milan and Paris. But how on earth are there fashions for certain types of timber? How does that start?
Now I'm not so sure if it's still the case, but it was always from furniture, product design, and then that led into architects using. So that's how cherry, walnut, maple, those waves that we've seen of light wood, dark wood, red wood tend to start in furniture. I mean, we're going with you to Copenhagen. I remember the boom in cherry 25 years ago. Everything was in cherry. And then suddenly all the architects were doing everything in cherry because the Italians and the Danes had started a whole sort of fashion around cherry furniture. That was great for us, by the way, because we had most of the cherry.
We established you have an awful lot of cherry.
That's why I'm trying to get it back. I'm struggling to individuals. My wonderful friend, Alison Brooks, who I admire hugely.
The architect.
And who we took to the forests in Pennsylvania, Alison Brooks Architects. And Alison puts cherry into almost every project she can. She loves it. She grew up in Canada. It was very a familiar thing. And there are others who celebrate it, but we haven't got the market to turn to it yet. But we're going to keep trying. We mustn't give in. And what's interesting is, the whole explosion in mass timber, that's been focused around a single softwood, spruce. Well, that's not going to go on forever. So there's now a big debate within the softwood construction industries about bringing into glulam and CLT and other structural solutions, other softwoods and even hardwoods, which is where we've
done some experimenting on.
Yeah, and this last summer we did, and in fact it's just gone up in Bonn outside the National Design Museum in Bonn, a structure we did Vert, which was in American red oak glulam.
Yeah, with Stefan Diez.
Yes.
We can't really avoid, I'm afraid, David, the President Trump question and how particularly his imposing or threatening to impose tariffs, how has that affected AHEC? Has it made the notion of selling American materials more difficult? How do you go about reassuring international markets that the US is still a reliable partner?
Yeah, good question. Yes, it has been a challenge. It is a challenge. It's sort of indirectly, we're not an industry or material that's been specifically targeted in any way, but we're part of the agricultural community in the US. And whether you believe in the tariff route and approach is right for everyone else or for the US or whoever, everyone has their view. But indirectly, certain industries are bearing the brunt of it. And the last time this was an issue in the previous Trump administration, it was the agricultural community that bore the brunt. And in places like China, soy is very important export, but so's hardwood. At one stage, 1 in 4 hardwood planks coming off a sawmill of any grade or of any of the main grades was going to China.
Yeah. I mean, they are the biggest importers of wood on the planet, right?
Yeah, massive volume. So if you stop log exports, which they have, and if you put 140% tariffs on, so the announcement just this week, there's going to be some relief and there's a possible trade deal, but it has disturbed containers in the wrong place, wood being diverted to Europe instead of going to China, a lot of wood going into Vietnam instead because they make a lot of product back for Europe. So it's disturbed trade flows. It's seriously impacted on some of our sawmills. I think they can withstand that pressure for a time, but not for a long time. I think one thing that perhaps people don't realize is that these sawmills are historical infrastructure. They're generational. So some of them are 2, 3, even 4 generations. So they've been built up over 80 years or more. And the huge investment to cut down a tree, to process it into planks of wood, even before you start making a product. I mean, tens of millions of dollars. So if you lose those sawmills, they're not going to come back. If I gave you $40 million today, what would you do? Would you go and start a sawmill?
I don't think so. Yeah, as much as I'm enjoying our chat, I don't think a sawmill would be top of my agenda.
I worry about that. I don't worry about the trees. The trees they've proved beyond any doubt that they are resilient. I worry that they are being attacked by invasive species,
right?
Plant and insect. I think that's a worry for all forests, particularly if you're trying to manage them for material and biodiversity or whatever. I do worry for those industries, and we're not the only example. There's examples all over Europe, all over the world of generational family community businesses that produce raw material. The margins aren't great. People don't want to pay a lot of money for wood. It's a shame. We should be valuing it much more. So at least what we can do is use more of the tree and just change the narrative around what's exciting about wood. We've defined the quality as something that's just mad. If you're a wood scientist.
Skillfully done. You've took my question about Donald Trump back round to the installation you're doing in Copenhagen.
Well, of course I did.
Yeah, very clever. Here's the thing. I'm not going to dwell on Donald Trump because this podcast will come out in a couple of weeks after we speak. And the thing about talking about him, it can all change. I mean, it's such a bizarre thing, and your podcast can be out of date before you know it, overnight almost. So rather than concentrate on President Trump, let's talk about you. Because it seems to me that you've done all these projects, many of which we've touched on in this conversation with your excellent team and an extraordinary array of designers, but you don't seem to seek much publicity personally. There aren't profiles of you on the internet. I've spent quite a long time looking. That's deliberate, I take it.
I don't do social media, really.
No.
I've got a very small number of followers on Instagram. The fact that sort of half of them have 50,000 or more. It's just, there's a small group of people who want to kind of check out what I'm doing. And normally I'm posting things about cycling or my album collection.
There is a lot of cycling on there.
There's a lot of cycling. So that's one reason. We don't promote the brand AHEC either. We promote wood. I lived with wood my entire life. I'm 5th generation. I spent my earliest memories in a sawmill.
Yeah, what did your family do? Did they own the sawmill, work in a sawmill, or what was the story behind them?
The sawmill was in Stafford, Henry Venables Limited, and Henry was my great-great-grandfather.
Right.
My father was 4th generation, and every Saturday morning he would go in when the sawmill maintenance was going on, go into his wood-panelled office. I can still smell that old office environment. And I can, it's when you sharpen a wooden pencil, that shaving smell, it was just everywhere. And there was a big picture behind his desk of I think it was an ash tree being felled by axe, black and white from, I don't know, the 20s or 30s or something. Amazing sort of memory that I've got. I used to go and play in the log yard. Health and safety, just, I was allowed free rein, and those are my earliest memories. And my lovely dad is still alive, in his 90s, no longer working. He's been retired a long time, but we talk wood every week still. He wants to know what I'm up to and what's going on in the wood business. And he used to be very involved, not just with the company. And it's a passion. It's a lot more than just a job. And I've been really lucky to have people around me who get that and want to learn and want to follow that passion. And you don't, so I'm the wood scientist, but others are brilliant communicators, or they're technical.
Were you always going to work in wood then from a child? It sounds like you had no choice.
It was my choice. So Dad said to me quite early on, he said, if you want to be a millionaire, don't bother. But if you want an interesting life and meet amazing people, I started working in the sawmill, the drying kilns, and learning about it from the age of 13. No pocket money. You were school holidays. You were sent down the sawmill to check in with everybody else. And it was quite big. We had 160 people working for us at one stage. Sadly, for this generation, it became a challenge. And I can see the pressure that's going on for my American colleagues at the moment. Once you lose that and, the dynamic or whatever becomes difficult, and that sawmill didn't survive today, but there's still quite a few of my family, my generation, are still doing various things in wood. But I chose to do that, and therefore I did sciences at school. I wasn't very good, and I got to do a wood science degree at Bucks College.
What about the next generation, David? Do you have kids? Are they into the material as well?
No, they're not. Sadly.
Does it finish with you?
I think it is, because I suppose I've created my job around my knowledge and experience rather than something physical. I did think about starting a small sawmill once, but decided it was too much hard work.
So why?
I'd rather just talk about it.
Yeah, no, fair enough. But why AHEC? Because you arrived there in 2000?
Oh, I spent my early years after doing my wood degree in Africa, running sawmills, furniture companies in Zimbabwe, and then running a sawmill in Ghana. And I brought that knowledge back to wood traders in the UK, worked for various companies, and wasn't really a very good salesman. I kind of did all right, but it wasn't my vocation. But it did give me a good understanding of global hardwood trade. And only time in my life, I was fired.
Oh, okay.
Came in one morning and they said, clear your desk. We don't need you anymore.
Right.
And it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Okay.
And I'm not going to name names because
well, you could.
The company per se doesn't exist anymore. But all right. It was an opportunity, and a mutual friend in the trade rang me up and said, there's a guy running a thing called the American Hardwood Export Council who needs some technical input. And I joined a gentleman called Michael Buckley, who had started the very early version of AHEC. And 5 years later, I took it over. Michael moved on, and I moved it much more in the direction I thought, now what can we do for the sawmills and the industry? They know about their timber, they're selling their timber. What can we do that they don't have the time or the resources to do? And so we decided to go and influence the influencers, decision makers, the architects, designers, and I've just had a brilliant time. I mean, if I had my time again, I would go back and do design, something. If I could, I don't know. Maybe that's unrealistic.
Was that AHEC project in 2008? Was that your first of those major projects?
It was the first collaboration, and it was the London Design Festival, Ben Evans, who put us in touch. And it then led to being connected with other architects, designers, but then quite often after that, we sort of began to say, look, this is who we want to work with.
The ball was rolling.
Either in Milan or London, but it was certainly the first big structure.
Yeah, because I mean, it's a hell of a thing to take on. And I'm just wondering if the rest of the organization needed some persuasion. I mean, I'm guessing the American wood industry is not the most progressive. I mean, that's probably being generalistic, but this notion of working with major architects to create a pavilion on the London South Bank, how did that go down with your colleagues?
I think that first one, because I suppose I can say this. I mean, in those days, there was more budget. We didn't have to underwrite the whole thing. And it was strategically, it was the first time this timber had been used structurally, because we had done unique testing with Arup in the early 2000s. And that changed the thinking about behavior of some hardwoods. So tulip wood turned out to be, and it's probably one of the strongest timbers for its weight anywhere in the world, of any hardwood or any softwood. So it had unique property, and it was our first chance to use it. All those years later, I took it back in a form of a panel and presented it to Alex de Rijke, who created the first CLT, and we made panels that were much thinner than the spruce panels being made.
The first CLT out of tulip wood.
Yeah. We then did another iteration with Andrew Waugh and Waugh Thistleton. What I've really liked about that collaboration is that they've pioneered a really unique thinking in terms of mass timber. And of course, we now have the black and white building in London, a 5-story or 6-story fully timber office building. Incidentally, you talk about success. We've also pioneered the baking of wood, what they call thermal modification. And the black and white building has thermally modified tulip wood on it that's fire treated. That's a world first.
Which means you can use it outside, basically.
You could always use it outside. Now you can use it for a multi-story building because it was also fire impregnated.
I see.
So that was a world first. So some of our experiments and things have turned into reality. Yeah, very exciting.
Which kind of leads on to my, penultimate question, because our time is nearly up. But in those 30 years you've been working in AHEC, have you seen a change in attitude to the material generally from designers, but also from consumers?
Oh, certainly. Absolutely. And I remember some of the first few years at AHEC, we used to go to building shows, and I remember doing one seminar at, I think, the Scottish Building Fair or something. I forget what it was called now. And we had an audience of 3. And one had come in because he couldn't get into the thing about water management next door. And another guy had came in and went to sleep.
Yeah, I've chaired some of those talks. Over the years.
And then it was only about 10 years later, we were going to Milan and filling auditoriums of 400 or 500 people. And because we got to know the right people who are passionate about wood, some of the names we've mentioned. And I think that's been the beauty of these programs, is that the people we've worked with have become ambassadors. We don't pay them. They've just got it. And they've understood what we're trying to do. And they go out and talk about the wood, and you ask them to come and talk about their work in the wood, and they jump at the chance. So it's gone from being a few specialist design studios, or particularly with architect studios knowing about wood, to now almost every practice has somebody who's responsible for sourcing wood or knowing about wood as a material in that practice. The media, I remember picking up architectural design magazines. It was all about other materials. And now there's a total transformation. And then, of course, the whole environmental thing. For the first 20 years probably of my life, we were on the back foot. My working life, we were the enemy. We were the people, you're the bad people cutting down the trees.
Because you're cutting down trees.
And that's totally shifted. Now we're understanding about well-being. We're understanding that we're wanting to embark as part of the follow-on for this project is to do some neurological research on what does our brain do when it's reacting to different wood materials and to natural nature. So there's so much more work we can do. Look at all the whole biophilic design. And what we've got to try and do is empower the influencers and the next generation in the design community that this is a material that's there for them, that's got a load of possibilities, that the support mechanisms for knowledge and information. There's so much more we can do, particularly at educational level. I just hope that the thing we've started and tried to get rolling, we've seen other people doing the same, and we're now much more in the sort of public domain in terms of narrative. Wood is renewable, it stores carbon, it's got all the arguments. So, as I said a while ago, it's a good thing to cut down a tree.
It can be a good thing to cut down a tree.
But not all the time.
Not all the time. But yes, as long as it's properly managed, in brackets.
Exactly.
Look, we're coming to the end of our time. David, I've had a thoroughly decent hour or so of my life. Thank you.
Pleasure.
We've plugged Copenhagen on a number of occasions, but it is happening 18th, 20th of June, Material Matters Copenhagen. What are your plans after that?
I think to continue that narrative, we've got 3 really exciting installations, but also we are creating an immersive exhibition around it, just with a lot of raw material. This is going to be a no-waste, very low impact exhibition, but it's going to be full of information and wood experience. And I think we want to continue to try and connect architects and designers to what the forest is. You can't take everyone to the forest. We've made a film. We want to launch that film. We want to create an interactive space around, probably online, using all that film material, talking about our projects. So I think we're going to be doing that kind of work. And then we're looking for our next collaboration, definitely with young designers again. We did the glulam with Stefan Diez, the vert structure. There's a lot more work we could do on hardwood glulam, working with, our great partner from that project, New Holzbau in Switzerland, who kind of pioneering the use of hardwoods. So we'll pivot in all sorts of directions. Yeah, I can't give away any more than that. It's all about Copenhagen at the moment.
All about Copenhagen. Good. But after Copenhagen, as the old cliche goes, it sounds like we'll watch this space.
Yes.
David, thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed that.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me. I really, really enjoyed it.
AHEC Europe will be showing number 1 Common at Material Matters Copenhagen from the 18th to 20th of June at Gammel Dok in Christianshavn. To find out all about it, go to our new website, which is materialmatters.design. That's materialmatters.design. We would love to see you there. I'd also like to thank the sponsor of this episode, 3 Days of Design. To find out all about the festival, the new design districts, and how to navigate your way around town, go to its website, 3daysofdesign.dk. That's 3daysofdesign.dk. And remember, you can also go to our website to find other podcasts that I've done and to sign up to our newsletter. There are also images relating to the interviews on our Instagram page, which is also materialmatters.design. One more thing. It would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £3.50 a month, you can receive an invite to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.